Okay, so what I want to do in this video is I want to teach you the entire course in 15 minutes. Or at least I want to outline the procedure that we're going to be using for most of the rest of the semester. Okay, all of the rest of the semester. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be analyzing arguments. And an argument occurs when somebody tries to give you reasons to believe something that they believe, right? It occurs when you try to prove something. So what we need to be able to do is we need to be able to take a text in which somebody offers reasons to believe a conclusion, and we need to be able to analyze that text to see what its component parts are and whether or not we have any objections to anything that occurs in the argument. All right, we're going to do this in the course of 5 broad steps, many of which will be broken up into smaller component parts. What are the 5 steps? The first thing you're going to do is, well, the first thing you're going to do is read the argument. And of course, this assumes that you've got it in written form. If you want to do argument analysis on something that you heard in a recording, the first thing you need to do is write it down. Either way, though, step 1, read it. Just take a little bit of time to read through it word for word. This is not a time when you want to skip or skim. And then what you're going to want to do after that is step 2, is you're going to want to do some elementary clarification. And what I mean by that is you're going to take the time to ask yourself, who produced the text? Who's the author or the speaker, if that's the case? Who were they talking to? Were there any major events going on? Are they responding to anything? Is the text that you're looking at written in direct response to some other text? You're going to ask yourself basically what's going on in the conversation. You're doing that in order to get the context, because it matters who's speaking, it matters who they're talking to, and why they're talking. Then the second thing you're going to do is you're going to look through the argument and you're going to make sure that you understand each and every word in that argument. And believe me, that's worth doing. I know sometimes when you're reading a textbook and your teacher's told you to read like 50 pages this week, sometimes you're going along and you may not know what that word means, but boy, you move your eyes across it and you're going to keep going. When you're doing argument analysis, you don't do that. You want to make sure you understand every word. So get out your dictionary. Or in the modern era, go online, Google that up. Be aware that if what you're looking at is a very technical piece, a regular dictionary may not do it. You may need to find something much more specialized, but take the time to work out what each word says. If you got the person there, you can always ask them, what's that mean? Also be aware sometimes people use words in very particular ways. So, it may not even be a question of what is that word. It may be, what do you mean when you use that word? Either way, make sure you have a sense for every word or phrase in the text, because you're going to go over this in detail. So that's step 2, clarification. Step 3, you're going to begin to analyze the argument. Here's where you're going to try to break down what the component parts of an argument are and how they relate to each other. For purposes of this step, maybe we need some examples. So let me give you the most commonly used example in every logic textbook ever made. And that is this: all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. I didn't say it was exciting. I just said it's used in every textbook. I don't know why. Yeah, well, anyway, maybe I do. Okay, let me give another example. And this is an example of an argument that could actually be made here at Illisaguet College. It's 50 below outside, so class is canceled. I think I've heard that argument a couple of times. Might even have made it myself. Anyway, both of those are arguments. And the whole point is, step 3, you analyze the arguments. Now, those are pretty simple arguments, so you might be thinking, gosh, that can't be too complicated. But we start with simple, and then you learn how to do this with more complicated things. All right, so what do you do first when you're looking at an argument? The first thing you do is you look for inference indicators, right? Okay, so in all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Is there an inference indicator? If you said yes, and then you added therefore dummy, that's an inference indicator, then you're right. Therefore is an inference indicator. Now, when you're analyzing the argument, the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to circle that inference indicator, right? So you're going to look at therefore and you're going to circle it. Let's look at the other argument. It's 50 below outside, so class is canceled. Is there an inference indicator in that? Yes, the word so is an inference indicator there. So you would want to circle that. So that's the first step in analyzing the argument. The next thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to isolate each individual statement in that argument. So if we look at the Socrates example, every man is mortal. You would begin a bracket before every man, go all the way through every man is mortal, close the bracket, and you will number that. It's statement 1. You would begin brackets at Socrates is a man, close brackets, that's statement 2. Skip over the therefore, which is already circled. You've already done everything you need to do with that for the moment. And then you would open brackets at Socrates is mortal, close brackets, that's statement 3. So that's how you would bracket and number the various statements in that argument. Each of those statements should be a complete thought. Each of those statements should be something that you could meaningfully ask, is it true or false? If you can't do that, then you messed up somewhere. Maybe you got only half of a statement, or maybe you bracketed something that isn't even a statement, and we don't do that. In logic, you're only focusing on actual statements, so you're going to bracket and number each individual statement in the argument. Going to the other example, it's 50 below outside, you'd start an angled bracket at it's 50 below, all the way to outside, close brackets, that's statement 1. You would bracket classes canceled, that's statement 2. The next thing you would do is you would create a diagram. And in logic, well, at least in this logic class, the most commonly used form of diagram that we're going to use is an inverted tree diagram. And you can see how to make those in some of the readings we'll provide for the course. But essentially what you're going to do there is you're going to take each of the numbers and you're going to put them in relation to each other. Okay, before doing that, oops, you're going to want to underline the conclusions. So in the Socrates example, we said therefore is a conclusion indicator, right? So therefore Socrates is mortal. Does that sound like a conclusion? Yeah. Socrates is mortal is the conclusion. You'd underline it. There's your conclusion. In the example dealing with the weather, class is canceled. That's the probably happy conclusion. Students are usually happy to hear that. You'd underline that. That's the conclusion. Okay, so you underline them. That tells you what's the conclusion of the argument, and you would set up your tree diagram with an eye towards putting that conclusion at the very bottom. So what would you do with the Socrates one? That's what we would call a linked argument. Statement 1 plus statement 2 going down to statement 3. And in the inverted tree diagram, which hopefully we'll be showing as I say this on a video, you will be able to see, in other words, that statements 1 and 2 work together to try to prove the truth of 3. In the other argument, it's much simpler. 1 proves 2, or 1 is offered as evidence for 2. So you'd put a 1 and an arrow down to 2. And again, those are really simple arguments, so you might wonder why you would bother diagramming them. But when you start looking at arguments that have 15, 20, maybe 30 statements in them, yes, diagrams really do help. They help to show us which statements are being used as evidence for which conclusions. And once you know that, you could move on to step 4, I think it is. And in step 4, you're going to evaluate the arguments. When you evaluate an argument, there are 2 major components. And what you're basically doing is you're asking of any given argument, has it proven what the author meant to prove? Has it proven the truth of the conclusion? And we have a word for arguments that successfully prove the truth of the conclusion. That word is sound. If an argument has successfully done what it's supposed to do, we say it's a sound argument. If the argument goes wrong anywhere, we'd say it's unsound. But there are 2 components that go into soundness. One is truth value, particularly truth value of the premises or the assumptions, the reasons that are provided for the conclusion. And the other is relevance. And relevance gets a little bit tricky. We can talk about different kinds of relevance. But essentially, relevance is a question of assuming that the reasons are true, the stated reasons, the stated assumptions of an argument. Would they prove the conclusion is true? And if the answer to that is yes, then you've got a high degree of relevance. If the answer to that is no, then something's wrong. Anyway, the point is you're going to, in the course of evaluating an argument, you're going to evaluate the truth value of any of the statements used as reasons for believing the conclusion. So let's start with all men are mortal. In this case, mortal pretty much means can die. If you were going back and clarifying that argument, that might be one of the words you want to look up. For purpose of that argument, that's the point. All men can die. Is that true? To the best of my knowledge, yep. So Socrates is a man. He's a historical figure. Hopefully you'll learn about him somewhere during the course of your education. But trust me, yeah, he was a man. Okay. So in that argument, you've got two statements that appear to be true. There's the truth value. Is it 50 below outside? Well, not right now. It's May. Suffice to say that here at LSI, we may at times hear that statement and it will be true. Either way, that's one of the things you ask when you're dealing with an argument. Are the assumptions of that argument true? The second component to evaluation is relevance. That's the if the premises were true, would they prove the conclusion part? And there are two different ways of looking at this, or two different sort of standards of relevance. One applies to what we call inductive reasoning, and another applies to what we call deductive reasoning. In deductive reasoning, all of the information that is contained in the conclusion of the argument will already be present in the reasons provided for believing it's true. What deductive arguments do is they rearrange the information so as to show you that the conclusion of the argument was or should have been obvious the minute you heard all the premises. And I gave you an example of a deductive argument. That's the all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal argument. Essentially, if those two premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. It always has to be true. So that's an argument that meets the standard for deductive validity. On the other hand, we have what are called inductive arguments. And what an inductive argument does is it creates evidence, or it presents evidence for believing something that is a little bit beyond the information provided in the premises. So in the other example, it's 50 below outside, so class is canceled. In that argument, the conclusion doesn't obviously follow from the premise. There's at least information in the conclusion that you wouldn't find in the premise. But if it's 50 below outside, that's a pretty good reason to cancel class. And in fact, actually, I think given the way insurance works, we usually have to do that. So the point is, if you found out that it was 50 below outside, it wouldn't be obvious, like 2 + 2 = 4, that class is canceled, but it would be a pretty good bet. And that's usually the way inductive arguments work. The reasoning standard there is based on probability. The conclusion becomes more probable once you hear the evidence. It's not obvious, it's not as simple, like I said, as 2 + 2 = 4, but it becomes the kind of thing where, yeah, if the argument works, you'd want to say, yeah, that's a good reason to believe the conclusion. That's why I give you two different kinds of examples. There are two different kinds of reasoning. Bottom line is, when you evaluate an argument, you're going to want to ask yourself, on some level, do the reasons provided for believing the conclusion actually make the conclusion more likely to be true than false? And actually, in both of the examples I gave you, yes, they would. In the Socrates example, the premises are obviously true. And there's a principle which we will learn about somewhere in the course of this course, known as, a principle during the course of this class. The principle is known as modus ponens. And whenever you recognize that principle, whenever you see an argument that takes the form of a modus ponens, you will know that that argument is deductively valid. So if you have an argument that has true premises and it's deductively valid, then you've got a sound argument. That argument has proven the truth of its conclusion. In the example dealing with weather, well, whether or not it's true would depend on the particular weather, but if true, I think the premise in the 50 below example would provide a good reason for canceling class, so that's probably a pretty sound argument as well. Depending on how things work. So both of those are examples of sound arguments. And that last moment, that part where I say it's a sound argument, overall, that's step 5 in the argument analysis, when you sum it all up. Now, it's not always as simple as just saying, well, yeah, the premises are true and the relevance value is high. Sometimes it's more messy than that. Sometimes you'll have objections and you have to decide whether or not your objections really are important. Big arguments with lots of different statements and inferences can get messy. But the point is that by breaking down an argument into all of these different components, you give yourself a chance to focus on each particular question that an argument poses. You can say of any given statement, is that true? And you can say of any given jump from evidence to a conclusion, is that evidence really helping me to draw that conclusion? And so that's why we analyze the arguments the way we do and set up the process of evaluation the way we do. You will be performing this process all semester. Looking forward to it.